Listen, I just want to welcome everyone here this morning, and we're going to get going with our program. And this is our second annual Turning the Tide Conference, Reclaiming Human Health by Restoring the Planet. And this year we have a subtext of what is our obligation to the future. And I think that's how we can really raise our awareness and turn it into action when we think about what is the obligation to the future, to our children. God, there's so many wonderful people out there who are such experts. It's going to be a day of a lot of fun, a lot of sharing, a lot of caring, and a lot of learning. And again, I think one of the main focuses today is to take our learning that we're getting today and the awareness and transforming it into action. And we have some incredible people here who will motivate us. I would like to introduce Deb Franson next. Deborah, as many people know, is from Senator Tester's office, and Senator Tester wanted to greet everyone today, and so Deborah is here as usual as his mouthpiece. And Senator Tester has been someone who has really been very helpful and engaged in the movement of improving the environment and improving human health. And we need to remember that, because so often we forget. We are 1 million people in Montana, and we have 2 senators, and Senator Tester is always willing to listen, and he's willing to be engaged. But if he doesn't hear from us, if we don't engage with him, he's not going to know. And so we are so fortunate, because most people in states say, I just have no political power. And we here in Montana, we have the ability to change our public policy. We're probably one of the few states that really has that ability. So I would like Deborah, thanks for coming, to just say a few words from Senator Tester. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Deborah Franson. I'm Regional Director for Senator Tester here in Missoula, and we do want to hear from you. Our office is downtown next door to the Top Hat Bar. You all know where that is. And that rumor about us having a pass-through window is simply not true. So Senator Tester's sorry he can't be here this morning, but he wanted me to bring this message. Thanks for inviting me to share a few words, and thank you for coming together to discuss such an important issue. Montana is home to big, undisturbed landscapes and robust populations of wildlife. Our rivers run fast and clean. This means we Montanans must be heard as we look to improve the health of our planet. The first step is educating folks and having constructive conversations about the risks of inaction, just like you're doing here today. Then we must look to enact policies that ensure our kids and grandkids can enjoy the same quality of life that we all share. As your senator, I will continue to support measures to improve the health of Montanans, as well as our land, air, and water. I hope to hear from you as we work to maintain Montana's treasured way of life. Thanks again, and keep in touch, Senator John Tester. Thank you.
So every day we're going to be writing letters and calling Senator John Tester. Deborah, yes, you'll be hearing from us. Thanks so much. Instead of just a usual welcoming prayer and reflection, we're going to do it just a little bit differently. But as you know from our panel last night, this is a very spiritual issue. This is a moral issue. And we do begin these sessions with grounding ourselves in that understanding and in that belief. And this morning, we have a wonderful woman, Casey Schultz, who is a nurse at the Women's Center, and believe me, it's been an incredible honor to work with her. She's from the Blackfeet tribe, and she's going to open this by reading a children's book to us. And it's a book that I read to my children and that we're reading to you in order to honor the children that are within all of us. And it's a book to help us remember, to motivate us why we are here today. Casey, would you come up? I love children's books. All the truth, everything we need to know is always in the children's books.
Can you hear me? No? Oh, is this better? Okay. Brother Eagle, Sister Sky. How can you buy the sky? Chief Seattle began. How can you own the rain and the wind? My mother told me every part of this earth is sacred to our people. Every pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every meadow and humming insect, all are holy in the memory of our people. My father said to me, I know the sap that courses through the trees, as I know the blood that flows in my veins. We are part of the earth, and it is part of us. The perfumed flowers are our sisters. The bear, the deer, the great eagle, these are our brothers. The rocky crests, the meadows, the ponies, all belong to the same family. The voice of my ancestors said to me, the shining water that moves in the streams and rivers is not simply water, but the blood of your grandfather's grandfather. Each ghostly reflection in the clear waters of the lake tells of memories in the life of our people. The water's murmur is the voice of your great-great-grandmother. The rivers are our brothers. They quench our thirst. They carry our canoes and feed our children. You must give to the rivers the kindness you would give to any brother. The voice of my grandfather said to me, the air is precious. It shares its spirit with all the life it supports. The wind that gave me my first breath also received my last sigh. You must keep the land and air apart and sacred as a place where one can go to taste the wind that is sweetened by the meadow flower. When the last red man and woman have vanished with their wilderness and their memories only the shadow of a cloud moving across the prairie, will the shores and forests still be here? Will there be any of the spirit of my people left? My ancestors said to me, this we know. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. The voice of my grandmother said to me, teach your children what you have been taught. The earth is our mother. What befalls the earth befalls all the sons and daughters of the earth. Hear my voice and the voice of my ancestors, Chief Seattle said. The destiny of your people is a mystery to us. What will happen when the buffalo are all slaughtered, the wild horse tamed? What will happen when the secret corners of the forest are heavy with the scent of many men? When the view of the ripe hills is blotted by talking wires, where will the thicket be? Gone. Where will the eagle be? Gone. And what will happen when we say goodbye to the swift pony and the hunt? It will be the end of living and the beginning of survival. This we know. All things are connected like the blood that unites us. We did not weave the web of life. We are merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. We love this earth as a newborn loves its mother's heartbeat. If we sell our land, care for it as we have cared for it. Hold in your mind the memory of the land as it is when you receive it. Preserve the land and the air and the rivers for your children's children, and love it as we have loved it.
Thank you, Casey, for reminding us. And I think as we go forward at a time that we know we're losing an acre of forest every second, we're losing 30,000 species a year, and we're looking at going beyond the framework of sustainability with our climate change. All this in the last 50 years and 150 years, and we are listening to the indigenous voice who had so much wisdom and continues to have so much wisdom. And we're very grateful for Casey coming and reconnecting with the child within us and with the innate knowledge that we all have. And I would like to present a phenomenal speaker. I was able to spend quite a bit of time with him yesterday, Dr. Ted Shetler. And we are so fortunate that he has such an obligation that he respects to come to Missoula, Montana. He travels all over as an expert on human and environmental health. He is the science director for the Health and Environment Network. He also is science director for Healthcare Without Harm and is a brilliant man. He did a great interview yesterday for KUFM, also for MCAT. I hope you all can hear it. But he has a profound understanding of our interaction with the environment, with our food, with the chemicals, with everything in our environment, and the impact that it has on us throughout our whole lives, from the time that we're just fetuses in our mother until the time that we die, and what is really pushing some of our diseases and illness and the disharmony that we have with our natural world. And we're incredibly lucky to have Dr. Ted Shetler, who received an MD from Case Western. He has an MPH from Harvard, and is a brilliant mind, and I'm so honored to have him here today. So Dr. Shetler, thank you.
Georgia, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you to you and to Beth for the invitation to come and for your incredible work organizing this conference in really the last several days. And good morning, and thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning. Thanks also to Casey for that lovely story. The web of life, that's what I want to talk about, and there it was, the spider's web. Was in one of those photos. What I want to talk about this morning is several aspects of the environment. And I will somewhat arbitrarily break them down in ways that are shown here on this slide into the food environment, the chemical environment, which really refers to not only environmental chemicals, but other pollutants as well. The built environment, we've done a lot of building on this planet. We've created a lot of environments that didn't used to be here before we started building. We've built roads, we've built buildings, we've figured out ways to move ourselves around on the planet with various kinds of transportation. They've all had consequences, so we might call that the built environment. And then I think it's important to keep in mind that encompassing it all is the psychosocial environment. Now, this is a somewhat arbitrary division, and these clearly overlap and create this web that Casey just reminded us about. It's very difficult to remove one strand from that web and sort of talk about it without understanding its relationship to all the others. I will do that, but I want us to keep in mind as we go along that these various environments really are in interaction with each other. As Georgia mentioned, we need to keep a life course perspective in mind. Really, human health is influenced by a number of different variables that actually come into play before conception. Someone said this morning already that, Georgia said, that the life of all children is here in this room. In many ways, that's right. You know, the current generations living on this planet do, in fact, represent and biologically have sort of the basis for the generations yet to come. So I will talk a lot about the life course from conception on through, but understanding that we are talking about preconception, and in keeping with the theme of this conference, we want to also keep in mind what the implications of all of this are for the generations yet to come. And what this leads me to is a conclusion that says that there are many ways we can interact with this complex web. And I think this day is going to be really filled with a lot of interesting ideas about how to do that. Individual actions, community-based actions, state-based actions, regional actions, federal actions, global actions. I mean, there are a lot of opportunities, and we'll explore them today with all the rich wealth of experience and ideas in the room. And I think it should be a wonderful day in that regard. So let me start by the earliest days, the earliest moments. Clearly, aging begins with conception, and a number of various environmental factors interact with the genetic inheritance that we all have to influence the trajectory of development right from the earliest days in the first environment, which is the maternal uterus, mother's womb. And it's really important to remember that these environmental variables are interacting with each other and with the genetic material. There's a constant conversation that goes on between various environmental variables and the genes, actually influencing the expression of those genes. There are impacts on the genes during development that can actually have lifelong impacts in terms of how those genes express themselves decades later. And the science of this is fairly well worked out. So we're not talking just about one thing, but we're talking about a number of things, like the nutritional environment. And when we think about nutrition, it's not only what mother is eating and what baby is eating, but we also have to think about the food environment or the food system that is producing the food, that is making whatever is available to us in our communities. And so the system is very much a part of this, as well as our individual choices in the supermarket or what we choose to raise in our gardens. Not only is childhood health and illness influenced by this mixture of variables, but we now know that later life health can be strongly influenced by health in the early developing years. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. The individual is really not, doesn't exist obviously in isolation, but as a member of a family, of a community, of a society, and of an ecological system. And there's a lot of crosstalk across these various levels of organization. So I tend to think of this as a nested hierarchy. Not that one is more important than the other, but that this is a system in which individuals live and are in relationship. And when we think of it as a system, we then begin to understand that it acquires qualities of systems. Systems behave in particular ways, influencing the various components of systems. Systems acquire tipping points. They operate in a certain way, but if they get pushed too far in one particular direction, they can acquire entirely new operating conditions from which it's often difficult to pull back. Often we don't know where these tipping points are. We're having this conversation in the climate change discussions all the time. We push ourselves, and many people believe actually that we've already pushed ourselves into inexorable climate change and global warming because we've already put enough global warming gases into the atmosphere to get a positive feedback loop going where it didn't used to exist. So systems have qualities, emerging properties that we want to pay attention to as we're thinking about these relationships as we go along. And I always think it's important to recognize that we can see reflections of those various levels even within the individual at the subcellular level. And I'll give you some examples later on where, for example, you can see in individuals who live in particular kinds of neighborhoods might have higher levels, chronically elevated levels of inflammatory markers that make them more susceptible to certain kinds of diseases and disorders, not because of something they're doing, but because of where they live, because of the qualities of their communities, of their neighborhoods. So we can see the imprint of higher levels of organization at the subcellular level. So here's just some examples of what I meant when I said that early life experiences can influence later life health. On the left here we have a child, a fairly newborn child, and I've given some examples here of what might influence the birth weight of that child. Maternal diet can, depending on certain qualities of the diet, might increase the risk of having a child of low birth weight or a preterm birth. Exposure to air pollution, increased risk of low birth weight. Certain pesticide exposures can increase the risk of low birth weight. But whatever the causes are, the child born at low birth weight who then experiences rapid catch-up growth during the early years of life is actually at higher risk of being obese in early adulthood and midlife. So that child now is at higher risk of obesity and diabetes in midlife, which themselves put the child at higher risk of cognitive decline and dementia and Alzheimer's disease later in life. So you can begin to trace this all the way back to early life events and see how cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, many of the things that are sort of chronically a problem now in our public health systems, in our hospitals, in our communities, actually can have their origins earlier in life. On the bottom of the slide, you'll just see some other examples to make this point. Some of you may remember or have heard about the use of diethylstilbestrol, which was a synthetic estrogen, which actually was purposefully given to women back in the 1950s and 60s, up until about 1971, with the promises from this pharmaceutical company that was making it that it would assure a healthy pregnancy. It's a synthetic, powerful synthetic estrogen. There was no evidence that it had any beneficial effects at all on pregnancy, but it was a marketing ploy, and many women took diethylstilbestrol during pregnancy. And unfortunately, we learned that their offspring were put at much higher risk of some tragic consequences years later because of their in utero exposure to diethylstilbestrol. Teenage girls, women in their 20s, 30s, developing a rare form of vaginal cancer, uterine cancer, and we now know that women who were exposed to diethylstilbestrol in utero are at higher risk of breast cancer decades later. There were also health effects in the boys, including lower sperm counts and some genital abnormalities as a result of the in utero exposure. We have data coming from a number of places now telling us that in utero exposures to certain kind of pesticides, like organophosphate pesticides, which are used primarily now in commercial agriculture, although there are still some available in the local home and garden store for your use at home. They're used, one of the examples that I use, because it's where some of the studies are done, is out in the Salinas Valley of California. It's an area that supplies about 80% of all the lettuce that's consumed throughout the United States. It's a small area, central part, coast of California. Farm workers are in there with their families in that community, and some scientists from University of California, Berkeley, have been studying a population of farm workers in that area for a number of years now and have shown without any question that the women who were exposed to the highest levels of organophosphate pesticides while they were farming in that area gave birth to children whose brain development was impaired because of the higher level of organophosphate pesticides in that community. This was demonstrated by actually measuring the levels of organophosphate pesticide residues in the cord blood of the babies when they were born, as well as measuring the levels in moms during the latter part of pregnancy. So we actually have good exposure assessments. And then these children are monitored as they grow up, and the kids at the highest level of exposure in utero have impaired brain development, and they've been followed now to about age 6 or 7. And this appears to be lasting, and it may well turn out to be a permanent impairment. There are studies now showing, not only in laboratory animals but also in human populations, that exposures to certain commercially used pesticides increase the risk of Parkinson's disease decades later. This was first demonstrated in laboratory animals, and then because of what was seen in the laboratory, scientists actually went out into the community in an area of California where those particular pesticides were used and looked at the pattern of pesticide use and relationship of people's living to the farm fields, and then looked at the risk of Parkinson's disease and found that the people who lived the closest to the farm fields where those particular pesticides were used had a 5-fold increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So you can see how we're all complicit in a food system that is so reliant on the use of chemicals and a lot of fossil fuel inputs as people from far away grow food that ends up in our supermarkets and on our tables. So it's all part of a system that we're embedded in, and we can begin to think later today as we move into sort of what do we do about this, we can begin to think about how do we change that system in ways that are favorable not only to us, but to the farm workers in the Salinas Valley and to the communities that are living near these farm fields. The other pesticide story I want to tell you is about DDT, which is no longer used. It's been banned in this country since about 1971. We all have some residues left in us because it's one of those chemicals that is persistent and bioaccumulative. There was a scientist at the University of California who a few years ago got hold of some blood that had been drawn in a cohort of women who were under study for other reasons that had been stored for a long period of time. And she was able to go back into that stored blood and measure the DDT levels that were present in the blood when those adult women were much younger, including some of whom were children, and determined that when you looked at the exposure to DDT, if you just looked at the whole cohort of women in the aggregate, you didn't see much in the way of risk of breast cancer as a function of the exposure to DDT. But if you separated it out and looked at the women who were exposed to the highest amounts of DDT before they were 14 years old, there was a 5 or 6-fold increased risk of breast cancer. So this suggests that even for breast cancer, early life exposures make a difference in terms of the risk later on. That's entirely consistent with the diethylstilbestrol story, where in utero exposures raise the risk of breast cancer much later. Well, let me just say a few things about what we know about chemical exposures in the general population. In 2004, the Environmental Working Group got hold of from the Red Cross, 10 samples of umbilical cord blood from just a random sample that wasn't meant to be representative. It was simply a random sample, and measured that blood from cord blood of kids born in the United States for 413 industrial chemicals. And they identified 287 of them, and on average, there were 200 industrial chemicals in the umbilical cord blood of these children. Among those that were identified are chemicals that are known to be carcinogens, and chemicals that are known to be developmental toxicants responsible for birth defects, low birth weight, impaired neurodevelopment, and so on. Now that was a very small, non-representative sample, but the Centers for Disease Control now has a program, and has had for a number of years, a program in place where they identify a representative population of people from the United States. There are several thousand people that they study, and every couple of years they measure a number of different chemicals in the blood or urine of those people to get some idea of what we in the general population are being exposed to. Those of us who aren't necessarily working with pesticides in the farm fields, aren't necessarily working in a factory where we might be exposed, but a representative population. So the latest full report came out in 2009, and for those of you who are interested, you can actually go online at the Centers for Disease Control and just look up the exposure report. And you can go through it in detail and see some of the information about what the general population is exposed to. So they measured 212 chemicals in the US population. And I'll just give you sort of a taste of what's going on here. Last year, some folks from UCSF took that database from the Centers for Disease Control, and from that isolated out the women who were pregnant at the time that the blood and urine specimens were gathered, and then said, let's take a look just at the blood and urine levels of, or looking at the presence of these chemicals in women who are pregnant in this cohort. That will give us then some idea of what babies in utero are being exposed to. And what this chart shows is the percentage of women on this axis here from 0 to 100 that had some identifiable level of these chemicals in their blood or urine. So at the top, that's 100% of the pregnant women. And the chemicals, I'll just sort of give you a taste of what's here. This is bisphenol A, a chemical that's used to, it's in the resin that lines the inside of food cans and leaches out into the food that's in the cans and then gets into the food that we eat. Also used to make polycarbonate plastic, which is a hard kind of plastic, sometimes used for food and beverage containers. 93-95% of all pregnant women in the sample had measurable levels of bisphenol A in their urine. These are the organophosphate pesticides that I mentioned that are widely used in commercial agriculture. The Salinas Valley photograph is down here. But this is not in farm workers. This is in the general population. And you can see that about 50% roughly of women who are pregnant in the United States have measurable levels of these pesticides in their urine. These are the non-stick chemicals, the fluorinated, the PFOS and PFOA, perfluorinated chemicals that are used and have been used to make the Teflon non-stick surfaces that coat the inside of pizza boxes, that make them stay so that the grease doesn't get through, that is used to make carpets stain resistant and so on. Virtually everybody in the United States has measurable levels of the perfluorinated chemicals in their blood. And then over here are some heavy metals like lead, cadmium, and mercury, and so on. And I won't go through the rest, but you get the idea that we are widely exposed to a variety, a mixture of industrial chemicals, and no one has the slightest idea what the impact of the combination of exposure to those chemicals is. Okay, let me move from the chemical environment to the food environment. You'll see some familiar things here. The boy on the left is getting some candy out of the machine. High glycemic refined carbohydrates now makes up somewhere between 20 and 25% of the calories of the average child and young adult eating in the United States. Refined carbohydrates in the hamburger bun, oils in the French fries will depend a little bit on what kind of oil the fries were put into. If it's a corn oil, which is likely, it's going to be very high in omega-6 fatty acids, and I'll explain in a moment why that might be interesting to us. And if it was a partially hydrogenated oil, it probably has some trans fats in it, which are known to be associated with increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Saturated fats in the meat probably increased because of the way we now produce meat in many parts of the United States by putting lots of cattle in confined animal feeding operations and feeding them corn to fatten them up more quickly, to bring them to market more quickly, but it changes the very quality of the meat with more saturated fats, more omega-6 fatty acids rather than the omega-3 fatty acids, which are a little bit healthier from the grass-fed beef, which happens when you have free-ranging animals. But notice also what's missing here. I mean, you don't see much in the way of fruits and vegetables. And this is a fairly typical diet for many, many children and young adults and adults in the United States. When we consume high glycemic carbohydrates, the refined carbohydrates as opposed to whole grains, we get a rapid insulin response. On the red line, it's high glycemic food. The insulin response goes up fairly rapidly and then comes down. So you get kind of a yo-yo effect of blood sugar and insulin, and then blood sugar and insulin again coming up and down. Whereas with whole grains, it's a much smoother response without spikes of insulin periodically. These kinds of spikes of insulin actually over time then promote insulin resistance, which ultimately leads to type 2 diabetes. Other people also believe, and many studies show, that this kind of yo-yoing of insulin actually promotes an inflammatory response, which becomes chronic. And chronically upregulated inflammation underlies a number of diseases and disorders, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, many kinds of cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases as well. So you can see how high glycemic carbohydrates are playing into that cascade. Among the fatty acids that are in our diet, as I've mentioned, the saturated fats increase depending on how we raise our meat. Then there are unsaturated fats, and I just want to sort of break them down into a couple of categories: omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. Now, both of these are essential fatty acids because we can't make them in our bodies. They're polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're essential fatty acids. We need them to some extent. But interestingly enough, if you look back at the typical diet of humans, maybe 100 or 150 years ago, we had a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids that, depending on what our dietary preferences happen to be, might have been 2 to 1, 3 to 1, somewhere in that area. More 6s than 3s, but a ratio that was relatively low. Today, because of the way we've set up our food system and our food processing and all of the various additives, oil additives that we've got into food, it's now not uncommon at all for people in the United States to be eating a diet where the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is 15 or 20 to 1. So we need the 6s and 3s, but we don't need this skewed ratio. We have far too few 3s and far too many 6s in comparison to the 3s. And why is this important? Well, because they have very different biologic effects. So here are the 3s, and here are the 6s, and here are the saturated fats. And the basic point I want to make is that when omega-3 fatty acids are processed in the body, they're literally converted into chemicals called eicosanoids. The name isn't particularly important, but the take-home message is that the eicosanoids that come from omega-3 fatty acids are almost exclusively anti-inflammatory in their properties. Whereas the omega-6 fatty acids, which also are converted into eicosanoids, are converted into mixtures of anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory chemicals. And the pro-inflammatory eicosanoids predominate. And so as we've driven our diet to this high ratio of 6s to 3s, we've actually created a pro-inflammatory diet. Now, this all comes out of the food system that we've built. So when you walk into the supermarket, you're at the end stage of a chain that goes from farm to market that's gone through a lot of processing on the way. And because there's often a great distance that food has to travel, and we don't want it to perish, it's been processed, and it turns out that the omega-6s have a longer shelf life than omega-3s. And so you'll find stuff in a supermarket that's still edible. It hasn't spoiled. It hasn't gone rancid, but it's loaded with 6s. And the 3s have a much shorter half-life, and so they don't tend to be as prominent. But there are ways to get them if we just know where they are in the diet. So if we put this all together, we can say with confidence that there are certain things that increase the risk of disease, including saturated and trans fats, high glycemic carbohydrates, lack of fruits and vegetables, and the omega-3s with a large excess of 6s over 3s. All increase the risk of a number of diseases and disorders: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, neurodegenerative diseases later in life, and so on, various kinds of cancer. Whereas a diet that reduces these risks is characterized by lots of fruits and vegetables, more omega-3 fatty acids, which come from fish, walnuts, flax. Pasture-fed animals have higher levels, and low glycemic carbohydrates, meaning whole grains and so on, which many times is bundled together in what people call a Mediterranean diet or a Mediterranean-like diet. And many studies show us that a Mediterranean-like diet is very beneficial, precisely for the diseases and disorders which are sort of swamping our healthcare system in our communities and our families right now. dramatically lower risks of diabetes, all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality, cancer mortality, Alzheimer's literally. The earliest studies that have been done are now showing a beneficial effect of a Mediterranean-like diet. And we even have a single study now that looked at the Mediterranean diet and Parkinson's disease and found a decreased risk. And if you look at clinical intervention studies, these are not just observational studies, but this is actually where people intervene with two different groups, you find similar kinds of outcomes with improvement in decreased heart attacks, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and so on. So there's the food environment. We've built it. We're experiencing the consequences. We can approach this either at as a matter of individual choice, but we can also think about this as a system that needs to be modified in order to make a more nutritious and beneficial diet available to people in general. I don't want to just forget about mentioning the importance of exercise. And for many people, exercise and the ability to exercise is very much a function of the built environment in which they live. I mean, if you live in a place where you can't get out and exercise, either because you don't have sidewalks, you don't have a safe neighborhood in which you can get out and feel secure in getting out and getting exercise. You can see how exercise is related to the built environment. But this combination of diet and exercise is extraordinarily important in terms of thinking about its health implications, all part of the environment that we've created. And the socioeconomic environment is also extraordinarily important. There's just sort of a headline that one can say that for practically all diseases and disorders, people who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder are at higher risk than people who are higher on the socioeconomic ladder. There are exceptions. There are few, however, but for virtually all the important diseases that are highly prevalent in our communities now, that's the case, that social status matters. And there are explanations for it. People who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder are often more likely to be exposed to a variety of potentially harmful environmental hazards, but also biologically less capable of responding. They have less resilience. They're living closer to the threshold where you tip over one of those tipping points into pathology. And so it's a combination of increased exposures and decreased ability to respond that is undoubtedly at play here. Well, okay, so I've sort of torn this idea of environment apart into pieces, and now the challenge is how do we put this all together and make sense about it? How do we think about it in our own lives? How do we think of it in terms of public policy? Science and Decisions is a book that a report that came from the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago that was addressing primarily the whole problem of doing chemical risk assessments. And their recommendation was, look, we've been doing chemical risk assessments for a long time, but we really haven't been doing them as well as we ought to. We really need to begin to think about the combination of chemicals that people are exposed to, because we know that's the case. I just showed you that's true. And we need to think about other circumstances in the real world that people live in. The socioeconomic status, their diet and nutrition, and how that might influence the response to environmental chemicals. So this is putting it together in what might be called a cumulative risk assessment, but putting it together is, of course, very challenging. And I want to just give a couple of examples here of why it's important, that this is not just a theoretical concern. And I thought that I would talk about a couple of health effects of air pollution just to illustrate this issue. There are a number of health effects of air pollution, including cardiovascular problems, respiratory disease, reproductive and developmental problems, including low birth weight, which I mentioned, and then cancer, lung cancer, and maybe even leukemia in children. But I'm going to concentrate just here on two of them just to illustrate. One is asthma and one is premature birth. Now, we know that air pollutants can trigger asthma attacks and increase their severity, and we know a lot about certain components of air pollution that are more problematic than others. Ozone can actually increase the likelihood that you will develop asthma, as well as increase the likelihood of your having asthma attacks if you already have asthma. And we know that lower socioeconomic status is consistently associated with more problems with asthma. Now, I just wanted to show you data from a couple of studies. I'm not going to get down in the weeds here too far, but I wanted to show you that there actually are data to support this idea that there is an interaction between socioeconomic status and your response to air pollution. So this was a study done in people who already have asthma. And what the scientists were interested in was whether or not being exposed to more air pollution from traffic would increase the likelihood of having an asthma attack. But they did one other thing. They divided this group of people up into people who lived below the poverty level and those people who lived above the poverty level, because they wanted to see whether there was a different response to the same amount of air pollution. So what you see here is that traffic density increases as you go from here to here, from very low vehicle miles traveled to up to hundreds of thousands of vehicle miles traveled. And here are people living below the federal poverty level, and here are people living above the poverty level. And what you see is that for the people who are poor, below the federal poverty line, they are almost 3 times more likely to have asthma attacks when they're exposed to more air pollution than people who are exposed to the lowest amounts of air pollution. If you look at people who are not poor, it's only about half that risk compared to the people who are people who are exposed to less air pollution. So the conclusion is that people who are poor had twice the risk, or nearly twice the risk, of asthma attacks compared to people who are not poor when exposed to the same amount of air pollution. Well, why should people who are poor have more problems with asthma? And there are a number of theories about that. Maybe more exposure to other asthma triggers, maybe reduced access to health care, maybe people who are poor don't take their medicines as well as people who are not poor. Maybe there's a compliance issue there. Maybe there are other psychosocial factors. So one study that tried to address this was a small study, just 76 people. These are 13-year-old kids. Half of them had asthma, half of them didn't have asthma. And what the scientists did was measure an inflammatory marker in their blood. That's this thing here. It's interleukin-13. I don't need to go into the details to make the point. It's a marker of inflammation. And asthma is an inflammatory disease. And the higher the inflammatory index is in people, the more likely they are to have an asthma attack if they already have asthma. And what this study showed was that this is now this inflammatory marker is being measured at a time when none of these children are having an asthma attack. They're all symptom-free. But half of them have a history of asthma and half of them don't. And what you can see is that as the children who lived in families who were quite poor had a baseline level of an inflammatory marker that was significantly higher at baseline than the kids who lived in a family that was better off. When they measured the home stress in the same group of people, and home stress is an index measure that is comprised of a number of different measures that have to do with things like not only economic status, but access to transportation, access to food, feeling safe in where you live, having control over certain aspects of your life. You can compile all that into an index of home stress, and you see here the same thing, that the kids who came from homes that had higher levels of home stress had baseline levels of this inflammatory marker were higher. These kids are living closer to the threshold. They're more easily tipped over into an asthma attack when they're exposed to a given amount of air pollution compared to the kids who are better off. Another study asked the same question, but this time said, well, let's not start with kids who already have asthma. Let's look prospectively and see about the likelihood that air pollution and socioeconomic status is going to influence the likelihood that you're going to get asthma as we follow you over time. So this was a prospective study of about 2,500 kids who were 5 to 9 years old when they were enrolled in the study, and then air pollution was estimated by looking at where they lived in relationship to the traffic on the roads nearby, and they did a similar stress scale that measured sort of stress factors in the home, and then followed these kids over time. And the results were that asthma risk increased for everybody with increased air pollution from nearby traffic. But the increase was greater in the children who were living in homes of higher stress or lower socioeconomic circumstances. That they too were showing they were more likely to get asthma initially as a combination of the exposure to the air pollution and their socioeconomic status. It was actually quite a large magnitude effect, about the same as the likelihood of getting asthma in a relationship to exposure to cigarette smoke. And this is just the results shown graphically. There was about a 50% increased risk of developing asthma in the kids who were of lower socioeconomic status when they were exposed to the same amount of air pollution. Let me move on quickly to preterm birth. This has been an intractable problem in the United States. It's a huge problem. There are far too many babies born early. A number of people have been trying to understand why this is the case, but it has major consequences, as I described earlier. Preterm birth puts a child at risk for a number of problems down the road, and so it's something that we really would try to understand. And I've listed here on this slide a number of the known risk factors for preterm birth, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, except to show that there are a number of them. And when we think about a causal web, I mean, this is a complicated causal web, and there's not going to be a single silver bullet in here that's going to solve this problem. But I want to just focus, for the purposes of this discussion, on air pollution because it is clearly recognized now as one of the risk factors for preterm birth. So this is a study that was done in Southern California that wondered whether or not preterm birth was more likely during seasons when air pollution was higher, because there are inversions, and I understand you have inversions here in Missoula as well, so you have seasonal changes and fluctuations in your air pollution here. And so the question was, during the winter when there are inversions and more air pollution in this area in Southern California, what happens to preterm birth? So that was the question. And they also divided it out then, after they identified the study group, they divided them out by socioeconomic status. So they defined socioeconomic status as shown here. Low status were neighborhoods that had more than 10% unemployment, and so on. You can see families living in poverty, those receiving public assistance, and then higher socioeconomic status were neighborhoods that were characterized by less of that. And what they found was that in the lower socioeconomic status community, now remember, this is a community level of socioeconomic status. It's not an individual level. This is a community that people are living in. That more exposure to the traffic-related air pollution increased the risk of preterm delivery by 30% when in the winter months when the air pollution went higher, if you lived in the lower socioeconomic status community. Whereas if you lived in the higher socioeconomic status community, the traffic density and air pollution didn't increase the preterm risk of birth at all. And if you lived in the middle SES tertile, there was an intermediate increase of 18 to 19%. So you can see again an effect modification of socioeconomic status on the response to exposure to air pollution in terms of preterm birth, entirely consistent with the asthma story that I also told. They concluded, by the way, in this paper that reducing preterm births warrants a concerted effort of social, economic, and environmental policies. Across the board, social, economic, and environmental policies focus not only on individual risk factors, but also the reduction of localized air pollution, expansion of healthcare coverage, and improvement of neighborhood resources. So this is a public health response that they're recommending, not simply a behavioral change of an individual, but we have to do things at the neighborhood and community level here if we're going to tackle this problem. This is another study showing how exposure to environmental tobacco smoke in utero actually impairs babies' brain development if there's associated maternal hardships that are experienced late in pregnancy. At least one episode of having limited access to the appropriate amount of food, shelter, or clothing. The environmental tobacco smoke and maternal hardship had a much larger impact on neurological development of babies than if it was just the environmental tobacco smoke alone. Lead is another example. We know and have known for a long time that lead interferes with normal babies' brain development, and not only does it have an impact on infants, but it appears to be a lifelong effect, with people exposed to higher levels of lead during development, more problems finishing school, more likely to run into trouble with the law, more difficulty holding down a job, and so on. So that's pretty clear, and we have known that for a long time. We also know that iron deficiency in the diet by itself impairs brain development in babies. And this is not kids who are iron deficient to the point where they actually have anemia, but this is a diet that is deficient in iron. This is one of the most prominent, prevalent nutritional deficiencies in the world, and by itself interferes with adequate brain development. And we also know that if the child is exposed to lead and has a diet that's deficient in iron, that child absorbs more lead from the intestine, more lead is circulating through the blood, more lead gets into the brain because of the iron deficiency in the diet. And the biology of that is fairly well worked out. We also know that lower socioeconomic status by itself has an impact on babies' brain development and function over many years without having the added neurotoxicants and dietary deficiencies. And so when you put these all together, you find that the child who is of lower socioeconomic status, exposed to lead, and has an iron-deficient diet is really getting a triple whammy. And intervention studies show that if you just address one of those but not the other two, you just don't make any progress at all. And if you really have a concerted effort to address all three of them, you make some progress in terms of improving outcomes for the child, but you never get back to where the child would have been if it had been avoided in the first place. The brain has some plasticity, but it's not sufficient to overcome all of these stressors that are combined. We now know that lead also has an impact on the brain of older people. We've always worried and known about its effects on younger people, and now we can measure bone lead levels through an X-ray fluorescence technology that gives us an idea of what cumulative exposure to lead over a lifetime has been, and have shown that people who have had higher lifetime exposures to lead throughout their lives are more likely to experience earlier and more profound cognitive decline later in life. And interestingly enough, that effect has been shown to be larger in people who are living in stressful neighborhoods, neighborhoods where they don't feel safe, where they need to feel particularly vigilant as a matter of their daily lives, that those people who have higher levels of lead in their bones as a result of cumulative exposures over time have more rapid cognitive decline later in life than those people who live in safer, more cohesive, and secure neighborhoods. So we put these together and we understand that this really is a causal web, that there are interactions across the profile of genetic makeup, nutrition, and micronutrients, the chemical environment, and various toxicants. What I've written on this slide here is a quote from Bernie Weiss, who's a neurotoxicologist, and David Bellinger, a neuroscientist, who say that the ecologic setting in which toxic chemicals act create unique, enduring individual vulnerabilities that warrant the same status as genetic predispositions and are imprinted as forcefully. So what do we do about all this? Well, we're going to be talking about this today. There are categories of opportunities and challenges. Clearly, there's a lot of research that needs to be done. There are many opportunities for weaving some of these ideas into clinical practice for people who are in clinical practice. There are cross-sectoral and cross-cutting solutions that I'm particularly interested in, and I think we might want to explore how we can address several of these problems simultaneously by being creative about particular interventions that we might come up with, as well as the need for improved regulations and government response and so forth based on what this new science is telling us. I wanted to make you aware of a project I've been working on with colleagues called the Cumulative Impacts Project, where we're really saying, look, we live in a world that does have cumulative stressors. I mean, that come together, that create this causal web that's either disease promoting or, on the alternative, it's resilience, health promoting. But there are a number of resources that we've pulled together on this website, and this URL up here is cumulativeimpacts.org. So easy to remember. It's publicly available. And when you go there, this is the home page, and there's a wealth of information on this website now. For example, there's a searchable database there for resources, and this is what that page looks like. And you can search this by a number of search strategies focusing on ecosystems or communities or human health with whatever focus you're interested in and so forth, and you just plug in your search terms and you'll find a number of resources there that hope you'll find useful. Remember also that when we're, as I said, we're looking for cross-cutting solutions, a lot of the things that I've described that are driving the chronic disease and disorders and the patterns of disease that we're seeing are also the very things that are in some cases driving greenhouse gases and climate change, which also has enormous amounts of human health implications. So as we think about that and talk about it, I think there's going to be some discussion about that in one of the breakout sessions today, but Missoula is going to be feeling impacts of climate change with wildfires and changes in water dynamics in the system here and so on. So, and environmental refugees, I mean, their whole story is going to be told here as well. As we think about how we might interact, for example, with the food system, we can imagine how we can improve it in ways that not only improve human health, but also drive down this climate changing effects that the food system is having through all the fossil fuel combustion, greenhouse gases, and so on. So thinking across these sectors about how we might address some of these problems. So sustainable food production, clean and renewable energy, and the opportunities we have for that. Transportation planning that not only reduce air pollution but also increase the likelihood that people are exercising, likelihood that people are getting together and having more cohesive neighborhoods, which addresses some of the social issues. We clearly need chemical regulatory reform. We have a federal law called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which hasn't been reformed in any way since it was first passed in 1976. And I showed you the mixture of chemicals that are in babies at the time they're born here. I've shown you chemicals that have been identified, and many of those have actually been studied. But there are tens of thousands of chemicals that have not been studied at all. We have no idea what their safety profile is. So we really clearly need some reform of that as well. And there are plenty of business opportunities here with safer substitute programs, green product design. Many progressive companies are seeing this as a really economic opportunity to begin to address this collection of problems and be out in the forefront of companies that are bringing safer materials and products to market, as well as addressing the access to health care, which is so much a part of this, and particularly for people who are down lower on the socioeconomic ladder. We need to think about reforming the Farm Bill at the federal level. It's got the wrong incentives in it now. It's driven the very food system that I described to you that's putting all these high levels of omega-6s compared to 3s, lots of high glycemic carbohydrates, sugar, fat, salt in the diet. We've got the wrong incentives. We need incentives, change the incentives in the Farm Bill that will get more fruits and vegetables, not only in our supermarkets, but in front of our kids in their school lunches, fixing food assistance programs. And you know, the food industry spends about $12 billion a year marketing junk food to kids. And they establish these taste preferences early on, and then, of course, kids are hooked. So begin to think about how we start addressing this problem, thinking back, how did we address it with tobacco? When tobacco companies were marketing their products to children. I mean, there's a real parallel here in many ways. Of course, we have to eat. We don't have to smoke. I get that difference. But the food, the stuff that's being marketed to kids and pushed onto kids has got a lot of unhealthy qualities that are driving the disease trends that we're seeing in our communities now. So our healthcare system has a strong interest in this, as well as our communities and families. And I mentioned chemical policy reform, and there's a URL here on the bottom, saferchemicals.org, for any of you who might be interested in learning more about that and becoming engaged in promoting this through pressure on Congress people. Senator Tester should be encouraged to sign on and co-sponsor bills to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act. There are bills before the Senate right now that would do that. So support from Senator Tester would be appreciated. And I want to just close with this. Much of what I showed you, although not all of it, much of it came from a report that I did with colleagues called Environmental Threats to Healthy Aging. It's available on the web at agehealthy.org for anybody who's interested in it. But I wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Jill Stein, Maria Valenti, and Ben Rohr. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I think we have a few minutes for questions and comments. Thank you.
Could you speak just a little bit about the impact of coal-fired steam plants and the pollution of mercury, how that is going to impact health? And
the question is about coal-fired power plants and mercury associated. Coal-fired power plants are the leading source of mercury emissions into the environment in this country, the leading source. If it's not captured when it leaves the smokestack, it gets into the general atmospheric circulation and is deposited on the surface of the earth. When it gets into wetlands and waterways, lakes, streams, oceans, and so on, it goes to the mercury I'm talking about, goes to the bottom where it gets into the sediments, where it's converted by naturally occurring bacteria that reside in those sediments into a form of mercury called methyl mercury. It's organic mercury. That kind of mercury, organic mercury, gets into the food chain in the aquatic systems, and then bioaccumulates it make its way up the food chain. So those of us that are eating fish near the top, eating fish that are predatory fish at the top of the food chain, can often get quite high levels of mercury in our diets. And methyl mercury is rapidly absorbed from the intestinal tract and easily crosses the placenta in women who are pregnant and gets into the developing brain of babies. And we know with certainty, because of some tragically high levels of mercury poisoning that have occurred in several places, that the effects can be profound. I mean, kids who get exposed to high levels of methyl mercury during fetal development are often born with birth defects, seizure disorders, profound mental retardation. But the question has always been, well, okay, that's what happens at high levels, but what about lower levels of exposure? And so a large effort has gone into trying to identify a level of exposure below which we shouldn't have to worry and above which there may be some increased risk of neurodevelopmental problems. And you go back to the NHANES database, the CDC, and they identify somewhere around 12% of all women who are pregnant in the United States who have levels of mercury exposure that put them above the so-called reference dose, at which point and above there begins to be a risk to the developing brain of their babies. And so it's one of the reasons why it's really important for women of reproductive age in particular, whether they're pregnant or not, to avoid eating fish that are high in mercury. And you can find out which ones those are by going to the Food and Drug Administration website or to the EPA website. And you'll need to look at the state level because of freshwater fish. You'll have to look on the Montana state website, which will hopefully tell you which freshwater species to avoid here. But the irony is that fish is healthy. It's got these omega-3 fatty acids in it. And so the message is not to not eat fish. The message is, number one, not to eat high mercury fish, but more importantly, let's get the mercury out of the fish. Let's stop burning the coal, right? And just today in the Missoulian, I read an editorial that your governor is promoting this coal to the West Coast, looking for harbors to send it to China. But he also acknowledges that coal-fired power plants are a major source of greenhouse gases that are driving climate change. But his conclusion is, and I don't want to pick, I mean, everybody's dealing with this, right? We need this 30 or 40 years of coal to bridge us over to the next technology. Well, I mean, this doesn't add up for me, right? And the air pollution that is generated in China is going to end up back on our shores because of the prevailing wind, right? So this is a place to intervene. Coal also has other air pollution associated with it, as you know. It's a really instructive example of the biogeochemical cycling of mercury, as well as this whole idea of mining coal, sending it abroad, receiving the pollution back, and driving greenhouse gases. This is a system that needs to be intervened in somehow. We're going to figure this out later today, I suppose. But we got to shift this system, right? This is not just a single bullet here. There was another. Okay.
Is this on? Following immediately on that answer that you just gave, and first of all, thank you very much for your talk. It's been excellent.
You're welcome.
Missoula and points from eastern Montana to the coast are likely to be facing up to 40 coal trains a day going through Missoula and all these towns. 20 of those would likely to be full of coal, others would be empty. Each one of those trains would have 120 cars, up to 120 cars on it. Each car apparently loses about 500 pounds of coal dust as it travels west. I wonder whether your cumulative impacts project addresses anything like that, or whether you know how we might go about finding out the impacts of that pollution as it travels through Missoula.
I don't know if there's anything on the Cumulative Impacts website. You could take a look and see. There might be something there that's it's updated fairly regularly, and I don't follow it that closely every day, so there may be something there if you search for coal. The coal dust escaping from the top of the cars, I know, has been addressed. It's, at least the question has been asked. I don't know how adequately it's been addressed by coal that's moving east from eastern Montana, and actually have seen these 120 car trains moving about every 20 to 30 minutes heading in the other direction on a trip across the country last summer. And it's exactly right. I mean, that's what was going in that direction. And there were people who were trying to address it by figuring what you could spray on top of the coal at the top of the car that would create some kind of a sealant to keep the dust from blowing off. And I don't know what they came up with, but I'm sure you could find out at least what are the options if you were to sort of do a web search for that, because the question has been asked, and to the extent to which it's answered, I don't know.
Yes, I was wondering if you could comment on environmental threats as related to autism and Asperger's disease.
Well, I'll give you sort of my take on it. I think we would all agree that there's a strong genetic component to autism, but the debate has been over how strong that is. Where I have seen the field move over the past 10 years or so is that virtually all people who study this now would say, I think, that we're seeing a strong genetic environmental interaction. There may be people who are predisposed to autism and autism spectrum conditions genetically, but there needs to be environmental triggers. And what those triggers are has been elusive. Studies done, twin studies done have shown that, most recently have shown that you can explain maybe 50% of the autism risk by genetic factors, but that means that 50% is due to some collection of environmental factors. Now, people are all over the map in terms of what they think those environmental factors may be. There's a strong contingent of people who believe that thimerosal in vaccines is responsible. I don't happen to subscribe to that, although I'm open to the possibility that there are a group of people who could have an immune system response that would be idiosyncratic to mercury that might play a role, but in general, I don't subscribe to that. There have been people who have looked at some pesticides, and some have actually shown that some studies done in California where actually have some pesticide use data that some proximity to some pesticide use seems to increase the risk. There are a number of theories, and it's being widely researched and studied. But I think for me, the take-home message is there's got to be strong environmental contributors to this, despite the general underlying genetic susceptibility in many children. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
I'm not a doctor nor a nurse, but I've been trying to sound these alarms for a long time, so it's very appreciated that there is good science beginning to come out and show what's really happening in our community. My statement is when you have somebody like Robin O'Brien, who's considered the Aaron Brockovich of food, sounding the alarm on TED Talks, Jamie Oliver's on national television trying to convince school systems to feed children properly. That CORD study was done in 2005, so that's a full over 7 years ago. And Robin has also showed that while 1 in 10 people get cancer in the United States, 1 of 3 of those people are getting cancer because of environmental pollution that can be stopped. But we have a government that's willing to feed pink slime to our children in the food system, in the lunch program. And larger still, we have corporations like Walmart, Aunt Jemima, and many others that are feeding GMO products right here in this country while it's against the law in 17 other countries. So they willingly ship other food to other countries, but willingly poison people in the United States. As a doctor, how do you feel about the fact that the Pharmaceutical Association won't allow doctors to really speak about nutrition and cancer and its relation to nutrition and cancer? And how can we get our country, our government, to stop Monsanto, stop the Pharmaceutical Association from literally poisoning us here in the United States?
Well, I don't think that the pharmaceutical company is stopping anybody from speaking about nutrition, but they have a strong interest in promoting the pharmaceutical approach to diseases and disorders. I'm a strong advocate for getting much more nutrition into the medical school curriculum and into nursing curricula, because the data are clear. There's a lot of science here. That we can actually address many of these problems through non-pharmaceutical interventions, and so I don't find the pharmaceutical companies haven't kept us from doing that. It's just that we haven't done a very good job, I think, in our curricula. But on the GMO question, I should talk to you after, because that could turn out to be a very long conversation. But I'd be happy to talk to you later. Thanks.
Well, I wanted to thank you for doing such a good job of challenging a long-held view that I think explains some of the attitude that some people have towards the poor, for instance. There's this old myth that which does not kill you makes you stronger. And there are people that still believe that still think that the poor make their own problems, and that it is challenges and stress that make people strong and resilient, and that is an important belief to challenge, I think. And there may have been some truth to it at one time when junk food was more expensive than good fresh food. I remember I lived during that time, and we couldn't afford junk food, and so we only ate the fresh food we grew on our farm. And so at one time, poorer kids, they had more opportunity for exercise. They were expected to work. They were eating better food than the rich kids who were eating junk food. But now that has flipped, as you know. Now junk food is cheaper than good fresh food. Often people in poor areas, because of high crime and so on, have less opportunity for exercise. And as you've shown here so well, there's just this additive, cumulative effect of more and more and more stresses. Maybe a little bit of stress is good, but all these many kinds of stresses aren't. And it's, I think, really important for people to understand that the poor don't make their problems. We've built a system that is just not, pushing them down further and further, and they've become our canaries. The canaries in the coal mine. If the poor are suffering, we will soon too, because finally those stresses will add up for us as well.
Thank you for that, and I would just highlight your making the distinction between chronic, unrelenting stress and stress that is episodic, that is very different, that does not have the same biologic effects. The American Academy of Pediatrics just released a report which is publicly available and actually got some press coverage in which they talk about the toxic, unrelenting stress in childhood and its lifelong impacts, and made exactly the same distinction that you're making, as opposed to the child who has different kinds of stress. The child who has to move and loses a friend. The child who loses a parent, and an enormous loss. The child who lives in this chronic, unrelenting stress from beginning to end, and the American Academy of Pediatrics is taking this very seriously as being something that has biologic implications over the lifespan, that we need to begin to disaggregate this and think about these somewhat separately. So thanks for your comments. Beth, tell me when to stop. I mean, because
I'd like to. These are wonderful questions, and so I'd like to do a couple more right now. But know that you can talk to Dr. Shetler later today, and also you'll hear from him again this afternoon on our panel discussion. So let's do 2 more questions. Claudia?
Thank you, Dr. Shetler. I'm wondering if you have given this presentation before Congress, and if you have, what the response was.
No, I haven't.
I wish you would.
Yeah.
I'm a Chinese Ayurvedic herbalist, and my question relates to that, but I first do want to say thank you for your comments on coal. The central Montana area is one of the best for wind, so we need to talk wind. But your comments related to stress, et cetera, I work 1 day a week at the Poverello Center, which is a local homeless center, and Chinese and Ayurvedic herbalism, one of the things it's useful for, I see a huge amount of impact of stress, diet, et cetera, on the liver, on the heart, on the spleen, and this type of herbs, when applied properly, can clean the liver, can be used to reduce inflammatory conditions, et cetera, and even though that's by and far not the best solution, we need to get exactly at what you were saying in terms of reducing pollutants, returning the middle class to our economy, a variety of the things you've already, herbs, and can be used as a method, as a very effective method from what I am seeing as it is applied to helping the body clean itself and rebalance itself. And what I was wondering is, in your very useful set of studies and statistics, is the herbal regimen, and here I'm speaking Chinese Ayurvedic traditional medical herbalism, is that infiltrating into the conventional medical world somewhat in the sense of its usefulness in this way?
I don't want to speak for the conventional medical world as a monolith, because I think probably the answer is no. Having said that, what I do see happening is much more openness to integrative therapies in general in the medical world over recent years. And to the extent that Ayurvedic medicine is part of it, I can't speak to that. I simply don't know. But integrative therapies are obviously getting some attention, and I think we're seeing more and more of it in the medical literature. But I can't speak more specifically than that. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much, Ted. Please. Well, that is just a wonderful talk, and I know you're all invigorated, so I do hope you'll take advantage of speaking with Dr. Shetler and of helping us with this day where we really hope to discuss solutions, because we're aware of this complexity that he so eloquently painted and described for us. And the next question is, now what can we do, and what do we do? So much of the rest of our day is in discussing that, so we're thrilled that you're all here and excited for that opportunity. I'd just like to say a personal thanks to Dr. Shetler for being here, because you are one of my personal heroes. I appreciate so much your work, not only for coming here, but for your contribution to a healthier world and a commitment to the future. So thank you.